Well, welcome to another episode of Open World Chat. I'm your host, John Odom. Usual co-host Jim Dandino could not be with us today. He's currently speaking to the FBI, looking into possible insider Yu-Gi-Oh card trading. So we wish him the best. Maybe a couple extra blue eyes shining dragons.
It's time to do.
And we'll see him next time around. So our guest today is comics writer and editor Joe Glass.
Hi there. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, well, thanks for being here. I don't know if you remember, we actually met briefly, right as I was coming into the whole Bleeding Cool thing, and I covered New York Comic Con for a few years.
But I definitely remember you. I mean, I remember, those first ones, everyone was kind of a bit quiet, because, I think those first New York Comic Cons, when we kind of started the whole roving reporter thing back in those heady Bleeding Cool days, everyone was just kind of like, we don't really know what we're doing.
Well, I think it was the pink shirt year that was there.
Oh, yes, I remember that year,
yeah.
Remember it well. Still like a pink shirt, I think, somewhere.
Well, anyways, Joe, why don't you tell us about yourself a little bit, what got you into comics, and then really what led up to the Pride, which is sort of your emblematic work.
Yeah, sure. So obviously, Joe Glass, I've been writing comic books now for it's coming up on 13 years, I think. Well, that's not strictly true. I've been writing them for a very long time, probably since I was about 15. So easily 22 years. But the in terms of actually getting comics out into the world, it's probably been about 13 years now. But yeah, that's I do all sorts of LGBTQ, IA plus superhero stories. Well, not just superhero stories, just inclusive stories. So, primarily the superhero genre, because I love the superhero genre. So, as such, we've got the Pride, and recently we released the Miracles as well. I've also done books like Acceptable Losses and Glitter Vipers, and as of this month, just released now, the anthology Young Men in Love, which I co-edited with Matt Miner, and we released through A Wave Through World, and which seems to be going down the storm in comic shops right now. So yeah, that's kind of how I've been doing, and what I do and make, and how it all started, how it all began. I was a big comic book fan for years. I got into comics fairly early. Little sort of basic comic books, we had a Sonic comic here in the UK, which was not the same as the Archie Sonic comic or anything like that, but it was its own kind of thing. Mark Miller used to write it. It was crazy. Sonic stories is wild, but that was the kind of thing. But there's not really anything which I got regularly or started collecting until I sort of fell in love with X-Men stories, and in particular Generation X, and then that was me hooked. And yeah, it was just from there I wanted to make comic books. I love the world, I love the concepts, I just love the idea of them. So yeah, I started sort of trying to figure out how I was going to do that when I was a younger person, a teenager. A younger person. I thought I was going to be an artist. Very quickly learned I'm not that way talented. So I knew that I still like telling stories, and so I leaned into the writing. And I'd probably been, as I say, writing scenes and comic books and little sort of sketch out ideas and things like that since I was 15 or so, including some of the first scenes and characters for the Pride. Actually, although that book didn't start coming out until I was, I didn't start working on making it until I was about 22 or something like that, or 23, after university. I actually came up with a lot of it and wrote a lot of that very first issue in particular when I was 15, 16 years old. So it was just using things which I wanted to see in comics, which, as a teenager at that time, I just wasn't seeing. And that kind of then became my credo with working in comics, is I'm just going to make the things which no one else seems to be making, and that I really wish I had, or just wish I could see out there in the world. And that's kind of what I do.
Well, I know you've do cause work and have been involved in activism stuff, but it doesn't sound like, or, correct me if I'm wrong, going into this, I was thinking, your books are probably sort of an expression of that activism, but it sounds like you're just telling stories that weren't there, that hadn't been told.
Yeah, there's probably a combination of both. Like certainly with the Pride, it became very much a combination of both, and it kind of depends on the book and stories. Like The Miracles probably doesn't involve a great deal of my activism. It's just telling stories. It's just a good story I wanted to tell. Whereas a book like Say Glitter Vipers is kind of all about my activism sort of sensibilities and feelings on that. So it kind of depends on the story a little bit. But the Pride, I would say, is definitely emerging of it, because yes, there's a lot of it just telling stories which I didn't feel were being put out there and weren't being seen. But then as the story progressed and as I was becoming more mature and had personal experiences with activism and trying to fight for equality through my university LGBTQ groups, it just became part of it. Like, I don't want to give anyone the misconception that any of my books, but Glitter Vipers or for Pride, are like standing on a soapbox and having the narrator or the writer trying to speak through these little fictional voice boxes at you. But a big part of the Pride, which I really felt was important, was not only telling stories with characters that weren't out there in the world that I could see, but also were telling stories that me, my friends, my community were dealing with and tackling those issues. And that is a mixture of my activism, but also something I learned from comics, and in particular X-Men comics. And I think it was probably the Lodal era of Uncanny X-Men or something, or maybe the adjectiveless X-Men. But there's the scene which I always get drawn back to is it's from Operation Zero Tolerance, and there's a little aside scene with these diners watching the Prime Sentinels start activating and the news story about how mutants are being hunted down around the world. And the camera, for lack of a better phrase, sort of starts focusing in on this elderly Japanese couple sat in the diner, and the narration's just talking about how they've seen this before, because they were the ones who were rounded up and put in a camp on American soil during World War II. And that for me was not only it was done in such a honest way that it didn't feel like it was preaching, it didn't feel like it was pushing an agenda. It was literally just stating a fact in the course of a fictional story, but something which also kind of educated and kind of brought up something to make people think about and things. And it was certainly for me as a UK person and we barely we study the same things over and over again in history, and it's all UK British centric history. We never study American history. So this was something I'd never heard of. I never knew what happened. And it feels I would probably have found out eventually, but I maybe would never learn that thing if I hadn't read an X-Men comic. And I'm that's kind of amazing to me. But even a story, a little piece of entertainment, a 2-3 minute read, can teach people something. So that was very important to me with the Pride in particular. Was that's kind of what I want to have. I want to have elements in there which bring up very much real life issues, which primarily the queer community has to face, but done in such a way that anyone can relate to and anyone can understand. So hopefully the Pride sort of gets that across.
Yeah, and well, first of all, you're living the dream, man. You stuck with these comics. It must have been tough. You had to kind of will them into success over a long period. So more power to you. And then being able to mix it with your activism. That's, oh man, it's the dream, man. It's the dream. But, you were talking about, I'm thinking about that. I'm thinking about, the road to get going. You had to stick with it. Mm-hmm. You described, the writing appropriately so is stuff, that anyone can get into. Mm-hmm. So what I'm wondering is, how long did it take for you to push that through and get past, frankly, people like me? Because I was aware of the book. I'd glanced at the book. I glanced at some of your other stuff, hey, I met this guy, hey, it's cool. Look, I know this guy. And it was yeah, this is pretty good. But at the time, I didn't know why I wasn't reading them. Looking back, hell yeah, I know why I wasn't reading them. Is I was straight. These were gay comics. How long? I mean, you had to push through some of that to have the kind of success you've had now. And how long did people like me drag you down?
Frankly, I would never say we were dragged down, but like for me, something which was interesting when I was starting, like when I started the Pride was originally self-published, like paid out of my own pocket, paying an artist to draw it and everything. And the same artist was working with me and a couple of other writers to do this other book called Stiffs, which was like a horror comedy set in South Wales. And we would exhibit at Comic-Cons all together because that was a cost-saving method and everything. And like we were all working on the same books. Like they hadn't written the Pride. Like I was the sole writer on it, but like Gav had drawn for both books and things. So we just share exhibition tables and a bit. It was back in that time when, as much as we knew, like, we love comics, we want to make comics, it was still, I don't think that any of us viewed it as a career. It was still, we wanted it as a career, but we didn't see it as a job. Like, it was still just, this is a bit of fun. We're having a bit of fun with this kind of thing. And those first few years doing those shows where we'd have like the Pride and Stiffs on the table, it was always a case that Stiffs sold a lot better. Like the Pride would sell, like it would move, but like by nowhere near the amounts of Stiffs. And like it was, and like that was fine, like because I was just like, the people who were buying the Pride were like evidently queer and were kind of like excited to see a very visibly queer book at a Comic-Con. And
this is a great book, just objectively speaking. And that's, I mean, it's fantastic. It's a blast.
Thank you so much. And then you'd have like most people buying Stiffs because like it's a horror comedy with zombies and like it was right at the height of Walking Dead TV show when it was good. And
we'll have a show about that sometime.
So there was just kind of like it was totally understandable. I didn't think anything of it. Like I thought like, well, I'm getting the audience that I kind of want to get, like the people who maybe need it kind of thing. And like when I first made the Pride, like I wasn't sure anyone was going to read it. I fully was just like, I might wind up just be making this for me. Like I'm not sure if anyone does want this. And then after a few years, it just flipped. I don't even know what changed. Like I can't even put a finger on it. But like a lot more people started buying the Pride, and and Stiffs like would continue to sell, but like the sales would slow down. And it's to the point where like ultimately the group that we were kind of all went our separate ways. Gav and PJ went to other projects, which were doing a bit better for them. Drew decided he didn't want to make comic books anymore, and then there was me who just like fully into the Pride at that point and really doing everything I could to keep this book going. So like when Gav was unable to continue with it after the second issue, I was like, right, fine, we'll get another artist, we'll just keep moving. I'm not going to let anything like that derail it. And it just then became a book which a community of people were making, and it was a book about a community. So that kind of worked out. So it was just this imperceptible thing had happened, and it just caused a change. And I think probably as a result of that, a lot more heterosexual readers were checking it out and just finding they really enjoyed it. Now, I would say, like, even to this day, when I do Comic-Cons, like, if I get a heterosexual fan come up to the table and, ask what's the Pride about, and I start talking about, it's about queer superheroes, like, sometimes I still get that change in my face, just kind of, which isn't necessarily, saying like, ooh, the gays or anything like that, but just kind of being like, it's not for me then. But like, I think at one space, sort of what I think really helped maybe was shortly after that change had happened at the Comic-Cons was digital market opened up. And Comixology Submit became a thing. So like I put the Pride on there, and the Pride audience skyrocketed like overnight once it was on Submit, because suddenly like this was not just a little book being made in South Wales, which is only a few UK cons. It was globally accessible, and I would like travel the world and meet people who knew my book, and I'm like, that's wild to me. I've never even been here before. Like, this is insane. And I think because of that, it maybe prompted a lot of people who maybe thought, oh, this book isn't for me, to give it a try anyway. Particularly when like the book was so cheap. Like, it was a $1.99 purchase on Comixology, if on Submit back in the day. And like, I think we even were in a sale once, like where there was a bundle of queer books you could buy at once. So I think a lot of people got to try it. And once they checked out that first issue, because that was always the challenge, that was always the hurdle. You just had to get them past that first issue, but the purchasing of that first issue. But once they read it, they like nearly every time they would come back of like, this book's great, I really enjoy this. And like the audience that I have for the Pride is probably as strongly heterosexual as it is queer. So it's just something which built over time. It's not something I would say, but I actively did anything to try and change that. Like I said, back when I was starting, I was still viewing it as like, this is a hobby. This is a bit of fun. And I'm not in any way knowledgeable in marketing or anything like that. And I still ain't. So
you like, do pretty well.
I wasn't actively pushing. And then, it just changed. Like, it just felt like it changed overnight. And I think it just finally opened up. And thankfully more and more people seem to check it out every day.
Well, the omnibus is from Dark Horse is doing it. Am I making that up? No, that's right.
No, you're right. Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's really
Dark
cool.
Horse did that. And it's available, obviously, more places than it ever was before. Because now I like to see it in bookstores and things like that now. So like that's wild. It's like my little book, which I used to just sell as these little floppies with a local printer, is now in bookstores all over the world. So it's wild to think.
The landscape of representation sure has changed a lot in the major comics in the last few years. There's almost a sense that suddenly the big two are trying to play catch up. Yeah,
I'd agree with that. And in particular, in regards to LGBTQ representation, I would say it feels like they are doing exactly that as well, playing catch up. Because, and this is the frustrating thing sometimes, actually, because when you see a lot of press, particularly queer press, talking about these new bits of queer representation in things like Marvel and DC, they act like it's a first. But like, oh, they're doing a queer superhero, or they've just done a drag superhero, the world's first. And it's just like, hell no, I've had one for 13 years. I'm not even the only or first person to do it. There have been various comics before that. And a lot of those creators, and what I understand, like where it's coming from, because like everyone knows Superman, not everyone knows the Pride or Spandex or any other sort of like queer independent book which has come out over the years. But at the same time, a lot of those independent creators who have been doing this work for, at this point, decades, are actually queer. And it feels like they're not being supported in favor of the corporations and sometimes straight people telling queer stories. And it's fine. It's nothing I'm sort of like particularly mad about, because like these things are amazing. Like Tom Taylor's run on Superman, Son of Kal-El is absolutely fantastic. And it's literally that and Nightwing, in fact, right now by him, are the model that modern superhero comic books should be based by. Like various books, like the DC Pride collection is superb. It is absolutely amazing. DC's commitment in particular to carrying on that commitment to LGBTQ characters and representation outside of Pride Month is impressive. And it's wonderful to see. And I'm happy it's happening. I just personally wish for, like, sometimes it would be nice if the queer press in particular, not just like comics press, like, but mainstream press and in particular queer press, would pay that same attention to the queer creators who've actually been paving that road for Marvel and DC for absolutely years. And it's even a case of like some of the creators who are writing these stories have read those comics by like independent queer creators who've come before them, who maybe never had the chance to write for Marvel and DC, but they grew up reading those comics, so they got to see that queer representation, and now they get to do it at Marvel and DC. And that's amazing, and it's wonderful that it's happening. But I just wish there was more of a recognition of where it came from, and that the history of queer superheroes and queer comic books goes far outside Marvel and DC. And in fact, what Marvel and DC are doing is amazing and it's wonderful, but it's very new for them. And it's great they're doing it, but like in many respects, sometimes I really do think it should have happened a long time ago. After all, the reason I started doing what I do was because I literally woke up one day and was just like, well, if no one else is going to do it, then I am. So
you get the vibe from a lot of stuff that comes out of Marvel and DC that does have queer characters, that they're, you know, written by nice, well-meaning, heterosexual, liberal people who, you know, are all for representation, but that's like about as far as it goes, like representation of people with red hair or something like that. And there isn't, you know, I'm thinking, because I think something.
I get that. Mm-hmm. I mean, like some books in the past, I feel like that has improved, and that a lot of the heterosexual creators who are doing queer inclusive stuff are actually doing a lot better of it now. It feels like they're involving queer voices in some ways and learning from them and listening to them, and that's awesome. Again, Tom Taylor would be a fantastic example. But then there's certainly been a history of, you know, queer representation in comics which have been handled by straight creators who don't fully understand what it is to be queer, and you can see sometimes it being the case of like it feels like it's the same story over and over again, no matter the character, or that character, other than having a moment where they come out as gay, would otherwise be unknown to be queer, like because they never deal with any kind of queer culture or queer lives or queer voices at all. They are literally just gay in name only, kind of thing. And you know, there's a place for that, certainly, because like, you know, it's not like there aren't plenty of people out there who are LGBTQIA but don't relate to the wider like pride movement or the queer culture or scene or anything like that. But there's also a vast history, scene and culture that is just not getting shared in this medium. And that was a big part of, like I said, what I wanted to do was like, if no one else is going to talk about, like, it's not going to include like a drag queen superhero and talk about drag and things like that, which is a distinctly queer art form in comic books and medium I love, then yeah, I'm going to do it. Like, because why not? Like, I should do it, kind of thing. So yeah, it just feels like we're getting to see that more now because there are more queer voices who are actively being allowed to take part. And that's like in front of the camera and behind the camera, because like there's like editors who are doing an absolutely amazing job of putting these things together and fighting for them to happen. Because I'm not privy to the behind the scenes in some of these books, but like you can guarantee they probably had to fight tooth and nail to make some of these things happen. So it's wonderful to see actual queer editors and queer writers and queer artists actually being able to tell our own stories, instead of only having well-meaning allies tell it. Because like I say, a well-meaning ally is absolutely something to be praised and supported, but ultimately they can't always fully understand our stories because it's not theirs.
Yeah. So speaking of history and creators, and you think we'd be farther along in this process if Jim Shooter had never existed?
I would be remiss to suggest someone's lack of existence, but I would
had a different line of work, let's say.
Well, yeah, I would certainly say that he has a lot to answer for.
Yeah, I mean that would have been. Less so North Star. I think that, you know, the bizarre. Okay, nudge, nudge, wink, wink from the creators. Yeah, he's gay, but I'm not even going to tell you in an interview he's gay. I'm just going to go, and then finally, but. The Storm and Yukio relationship that was supposed to be there would have been.
The thing is, it's like it's not even like just him. Like there are various editors throughout the process. I mean, like even since him, who have stood in the way of queer representation for whatever reason, and sometimes who didn't think that they were being homophobic or that they were, causing a problem, who just thought that they knew right or knew better or whatever, but also maybe don't understand that, maybe they don't understand that homophobia is an insidious thing, much like racism is, much like misogyny is, and you can be actively taking part in it without realizing you're taking part in it. And like, we've had situations like that. Like, I think the whole thing which happened with the character of Shade or Darkveil at Marvel, like say, was that felt very heavily a case of, there was a bit of a homophobic backlash there without them necessarily realizing that that was what they were doing or that it's how it came across. I mean, like, that character had the possibility to be absolutely huge and to like ride on the coattails of the phenomenon that is RuPaul's Drag Race and things like that, and like merge that with X-Men. I mean, like, my God, you've got a powerhouse connection going on there. And it felt like Marvel didn't want to pursue it, just didn't want to pursue it for whatever reasons. And, seen as not being shy about sharing how they felt about how they were treated and how their time there was. And it's sad to see that happens, even to this day kind of thing. Hopefully that's no longer the case. Hopefully things have improved and that people have learned from some erroneous mistakes that they have made. But I would say one thing which always has me concerned is that we're 2 years into Pride Month anthologies now at Marvel, and Darkveil, I think, has appeared as a tiny, tiny little character in one panel. So I'm just like, the wonderful thing about this year's Marvel Pride anthology, actually, which I thought was great and was well needed to be seen, was the amount of trans representation in it, because that is sorely lacking in comic books. And they not only introduced a bunch of trans characters, but like they did a range. Like, it wasn't just like one, because that was the problem for years. When you had a queer character, if they did appear like in the 90s or early 90s, they all felt the same. Like, they all felt like they were nearly all white, particularly when it was gay men. They were nearly always white, and they would almost always come across as either kind of bitchy, condescending, sassy queer type who was not, sassy's the wrong word, because they wouldn't be overly camp. They would just be like kind of like a little rude and a little off, condescending and standoffish. Or they would be a term I absolutely love, straight acting. Like, you would never be able to tell that they were gay until they said that they were gay. And the idea of effeminate gay characters were like massively avoided. And I get why that is to some extent, because there was a time when one of the big companies did try that with Extraño, who was an incredibly effeminate stereotype, and people backlash to it. But the problem with that was, like, at that point, that was the only gay character there was. And like, at that point, gay men in particular were like sick of seeing that stereotype being the only representation of queer men. But then the problem was they went the other way. They didn't try and do a happy middle or be like, oh, right, well, let's just add another queer character to show there are other kinds of gay men. It took nearly 20 years after that for the big two to start being like, well, yeah, okay, let's start doing that. Let's start peppering in more queer characters. And when you have more queer characters, you have a chance to represent more kinds of queer people, which was great. But it even took them a little while to come to that realization, because sometimes you'd get like, okay, now there's like 3 or 4 gay men, but they're all pretty much interchangeable.
Right. Well, and they're always so nice. I think of like Hulkling and Wiccan and even Jonathan Kent. It's like the one thing has to be they're all sort of nice, and they can't have real bad days. And that feels like a sign to me that there isn't necessarily a right or
yeah. It's why I think characters like Midnighter and Apollo proved so popular, was because here was 2 pretty unapologetically queer characters who were not necessarily the nicest people. Like Apollo pretty much is still played as a big himbo, even from the get-go. But like Midnighter was an asshole. Like he would tear people to pieces, and like he would revel in it. And we never got to see that, like as gay men. Like as why certainly is why I loved The Authority when I discovered it, was like I've got this badass black leather clad gay Batman who is literally punching people's spines out, and I'm like, I never get to see someone like me in that role. And like, not that I necessarily want to go around punching people's spines out. Find me on a bad day, maybe, but but like that was exciting to see because that was so different. Like it was not just like, oh, this nice soft boy character who will be in the background, or this icy, condescending guy who, again, kind of stands in the background. You had someone who was front and center, and he was unapologetically hyper-violent and badass. So that's what I think like we still need even now, is more diversity in the characters. And I think that now that we are seeing more queer voices involved in the creation, we're getting that. We're finally getting to see that diversity in character, not just in terms of, their identity, but also in terms of like their personality types.
Man, you sound so positive and upbeat about this. It's so I get so cynical about everything. It's great to I sit around and I feel terrible about especially backsliding in so many issues of homophobia and racism and sexism, and I give myself a break from it by going to watch my Star Trek where everything's worked out. But
exactly,
but you sound like you're a force we're heading in the right direction here ultimately.
I mean, I certainly hope so. I mean, don't get me wrong, there is a cynical side of me which runs deep. So being this hopeful takes a lot of work and a lot of effort, particularly right now. But like I would say, like I certainly thought that we would be past all this by now. Like. Right now it feels, I think I did another podcast recently where I said this phrase, it feels like it was when I was 12 all over again, like coming out of the 80s and into the early 90s, and it's like we've backslid nearly 30 years. Like this is insane. And that's why like I want to keep on making the things I make and getting them out there, and like why a book like Young Men in Love in particular, which has just come out, is so important to me, because that book is probably one of the first books I've done which is primarily aimed at younger readers. They need it more than anything right now, because I remember what it was like to live in a world which is like it is now, where your equality and your safety and your rights feel under pressure all the time and feel like they could be stripped away at any moment. And I remember what that was like, and it was hard. It was terrifying. And like, no one wants to be a terrified 12-year-old or a terrified 13-year-old. So that's why I'll keep on making the things I make, because hopefully they'll see them and it will give them that moment respite, and maybe even a little hope for a future where they can grow up and they don't have to feel scared, or they can feel strong enough to stand up to the problems in the world. And in terms of Young Men in Love, that they can just think that there are good things out there, and that they don't have to be terrified all the time, and that even when things are scary right now, just a few short years, they will find something which, like I said, will make all that seem to go away. So yeah, it's definitely the main reason I'll keep on making what I'm making, why I make books like Young Men in Love and The Pride in particular. And we'll just keep on pushing for it. And hopefully one day books like that will be a dime a dozen, and I'll be out of work because everyone's doing better than me. But I will, until that happens, I guess I'll be trying to push as much as I can, even if it feels sometimes it's by myself. So, yeah.
I won't be by yourself, I'm sure. But God bless you for what you're doing. And, it's not just that you're doing something that needs to be done. You do it well. I think you're a terrific writer. I think a lot of great energy comes right off the page.
Thank you so much.
And it's great. So I guess we ought to wrap it up here. Tell the folks listening where they can find you on the internet.
So the big main places would be the Twitters, where you can find me at Joseph Glass, because someone beat me to Joe Glass. And on Instagram, I am at Joe Glass, with just JoeGlass. And of course, there's my website, which is joeglasscomics.co.uk. Where there's also an online store where you can get any of my books which aren't published through publishers, so my self-published works like Acceptable Losses and Glitter Vipers. And there is a newsletter there, which I do not flood people's inboxes. I only update every couple of weeks just to get people up to date on future projects, things I'm working on, and my thoughts about the world today. So yeah, sign up to the newsletter, jump on the website, buy a book. And if you are looking in bookstores and comic shops, you can find The Pride Omnibus and now Young Men in Love as well. So yeah, check them out too.
All right, man. Well, thanks for joining us. Can't wait to see what you do next. And I am going to go check out the website because there's a whole you got a whole library there that I haven't looked at yet. So I gotta.
Well, thank you so much.
Our theme music is by Christopher Piatek.